The boy's voice cut through the wind first, thin as a blade. "My mother and I are freezing." He was 10 years old. He stood in the middle of Abilene's main street with his thin coat flapping in the icy gusts. His lips were cracked and blue. His cheeks were raw. Beside him, his mother, Lydia Marsh, shivered in a worn black dress. Her wrists were tied with rough rope. The knots had been pulled tight. Her skin was already raw underneath. 3 men in heavy coats stood around them. One of them held the rope like a leash. He had a scar down his left cheek. He was laughing. The other 2 stood with their hands near their belts. Their breath steamed in the lamplight. A small crowd had gathered on the boardwalks. The general store window was full of faces. The saloon doors were propped open. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the wind and the chattering of a woman's teeth. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Then it went quiet too. The lamp outside the sheriff's office flickered. A sign creaked on its hinges. Above them, the sky was clear and black. The stars looked like chips of ice. The cold bit into every exposed piece of skin. The boy pulled at his coat. It wasn't enough. It never was. He looked up at the scarred man. "My mother and I are freezing," he said again. This time his voice shook. The man laughed harder. "That's the point, boy." Lydia Marsh pulled her son closer with her bound hands. She didn't look at the men. She looked at the boardwalk, at the faces behind the glass, at the people she had known for 6 years, people she had baked bread for, people who had come to her husband's funeral. None of them looked back. That's when the rifle cracked. The sound broke the stillness like a hammer hitting ice. Every head turned. A puff of smoke rose from the shadows at the far end of the street. One of the men, the wiry one with a knife on his belt, took a step back. His hand went to his pistol, but he didn't draw. The figure in the shadows didn't move. He just stood there. A dark horse waited behind him. The tip of a rifle barrel caught the lamplight. Then the outline of a man appeared, a cowboy hat, a dark gray vest over a light shirt, a red bandana pulled up against the cold. The boy stared. His mother's arms tightened around him. The man with the scarred cheek straightened up. He looked toward the saloon. The windows were full of faces. He turned back to the street. His voice came out loud and hard. "Who's out there?" The answer didn't come right away. The figure let the silence stretch. The wind pulled at his coat. The smoke from the rifle drifted up and vanished. Then a voice, low and steady, cut through the dark. "Step away from the woman." The scarred man laughed. But it was a different kind of laugh. Forced. "Curtis Harlan gave us orders. Nobody interferes." The rifle never wavered. "I said step away." The men looked at each other. The one with the knife started walking toward the edge of the boardwalk. He didn't get far. A second shot rang out. The bullet kicked up a spray of frozen dirt 6 inches from his boot. He froze. His face went pale. The boy's voice broke the silence. "My mother and I are freezing." He wasn't asking for help anymore. He was stating a fact, the kind of fact that should have mattered hours ago. The stranger in the shadows took 1 step forward. The red bandana caught the light of the lantern. His eyes were cold, colder than the night. The scarred man's hand dropped to his gun, but something in that stare made him stop. But that shot was hours away. Before the stranger ever lifted his rifle, before those men ever felt fear, the town of Abilene was already watching a woman die in the cold, and nobody said a word. It started at sundown. The frost had come early. The dirt on Main Street was hard as bone. Lydia Marsh was in her kitchen when the door burst open. The hinge snapped. Wood splintered. A man she recognized stepped inside. Roy Taggart, one of Curtis Harlan's men. He had a paper in his hand and a gun on his hip. "You're leaving," he said. "Now." Henry was at the table. He dropped his spoon. Lydia stood up. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just looked at the paper. It was a deed. It said the house and the land belonged to Curtis Harlan, signed and stamped. She knew the signature was a lie. She knew the stamp was bought. But knowing didn't matter. "We have nowhere to go," she said. Taggart grinned. "Not my problem." He grabbed her arm. The grip was hard. Henry jumped up. He tried to pull the man's hand away. Another man came in, grabbed the boy by the collar, and dragged him outside. Lydia screamed. The night swallowed the sound. They were marched down the middle of the street. The town was shutting up for the night. But people heard the commotion. They came to their windows. They opened their doors a crack, and they saw the widow Marsh in her thin dress, her boy with no gloves, the rope, the men with guns. Nobody came out. At the center of town, near the post office, Taggart stopped. He pulled the rope tight. He tied one end to the hitching rail. Then he stood back. "You'll stay here till morning," he said. "Harlan wants everyone to remember what happens when you cross him." Lydia looked at the rail. She looked at the dark windows. She knew what Harlan really wanted. She knew what she had seen 6 months ago. A circuit judge, a gunshot. Curtis Harlan's face in the lamplight. She had never told anyone. But Harlan knew she saw. And now he wanted her dead without pulling a trigger. The cold would do it for him. Henry pressed against her side. "Mama," he whispered. "I'm cold." She had no blanket to give him, no coat to wrap around him. She just held him. The rope bit into her wrists. The wind scraped the street clean. The minutes turned into an hour, then another. Inside the saloon, laughter spilled through the windows. A piano played. Men drank. A few of them glanced out at the street. They saw the woman and the boy. They saw the rope. Then they turned back to their whiskey. The barkeep polished a glass. He didn't look up. Outside, the boy's teeth chattered. Lydia's legs were going numb. She knelt on the frozen ground and pulled Henry into her lap. Her bound hands couldn't do much. But she could keep his head against her chest. She could whisper into his hair. "He knows what I saw," she said. "That's why." Henry didn't answer. He was too cold to talk. He just pressed closer. The wind picked up. A piece of paper skittered across the street. The lantern outside the sheriff's office went out. The sheriff, Tom Weston, sat inside at his desk. He had a bottle in his hand. He had heard the screaming. He had seen the rope. He did nothing. He couldn't. Not anymore. Not after what he'd seen. Not after what Harlan had done to the last man who tried. The whole town was frozen. Not by the cold, by fear. A fear that had a name. Curtis Harlan. A man who owned the judge. Who owned the deeds. Who killed a man in broad daylight 6 months ago and walked away because no one would point a finger. Not even the sheriff. Lydia Marsh was the only one who could, and that was why she was out here. Dying slow. With her boy. Henry stirred. His voice was a ghost. "My mother and I are freezing." It wasn't a cry for help. It was the only thing left to say. The wind carried it down the empty street. The boardwalks stayed quiet. The windows stayed dark. The town of Abilene listened and did nothing. It would be hours before the stranger came. But when he did, he would not ride past. He would stop. He would see the rope. He would see the boy. And the whole town would learn what courage looked like. But first, the night had to get colder. And it did. The freezing air tightened its grip on the main street. Lydia's fingers were numb beyond feeling. Her knees had long since stopped complaining. Beside her, Henry's shivering had become steady and shallow. The boy no longer spoke. He just pressed his face into her chest, eyes closed, breathing thin clouds. The saloon doors swung open. A man stepped out. He wore a long black coat that brushed the tops of his polished boots. The collar was turned up against the cold. His hair was slicked back. His eyes moved slow and easy, like a man who owned everything he saw. Curtis Harlan. Behind him, the piano music continued. Laughter from inside the saloon spilled into the night. Harlan took a moment to light a cigar. The match flared and died. He drew in the smoke. He let it drift out through his nose. Then he walked to the edge of the boardwalk and looked down at the woman tied to the rail. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the rope, at the frozen dirt around her, at the crowd still watching from the windows. He nodded to himself, a small, satisfied nod. "You all know why this is happening," he said. His voice was calm, almost friendly. "This woman here saw something she shouldn't have. 6 months ago, a judge came through this town, a man named Whitfield. He asked a lot of questions. He made some accusations, and then he disappeared." Harlan paused. He took a long drag on the cigar. "Now, I'm not saying Mrs. Marsh had anything to do with his disappearance, but she's convinced herself she saw something that night, something that never happened. And a woman who spreads false stories, well, she can cause a lot of trouble." A few men on the boardwalk shuffled their feet. Nobody looked at Lydia. "Now, I've been patient," Harlan continued. "I let her stay in that house. I let her boy run around town, but she wouldn't let it go. She kept asking questions, kept talking to anyone who would listen, kept insisting she saw a face she recognized." He turned then and looked directly at her. "You know who you saw, don't you, Lydia?" Lydia's lips moved. No sound came out. Her eyes were frozen on his face. Harlan smiled. "She can't even say it, because it isn't true." He spread his hands to the crowd. "So tonight I'm giving her a choice. She stays out here until morning. If she survives, she can leave town. Take the boy and go. If she dies, well, that's on her. Nobody's forcing her to stay tied to that rail. She could have kept her mouth shut. She didn't." He let that hang in the air. Then his expression sharpened. "But let me make one thing clear. Any man who interferes tonight, any man who thinks he can play hero, he'll find out just how fast things can go wrong around here. I've got men in this town who know their jobs. I've got papers filed at the courthouse that'll stand up to any judge who rides through. I own half the deeds in Abilene, and the other half, they're one signature away from being mine." He stepped down from the boardwalk. The frozen dirt crunched under his boots. He walked to within 3 feet of the tied woman. Henry stirred against his mother's chest. The boy's eyes cracked open. He saw the man in the black coat and went still. Harlan kneeled. He was close enough that Lydia could smell the cigar smoke and the whiskey on his breath. "You remember that night, don't you?" His voice was low now. Only she could hear. "You remember the sound the hammer made when I pulled it back. You remember the look in his eyes when he understood. You remember everything, and you told nobody." He paused. "But then you started talking to the widow down at the boarding house. You started writing letters, and now look at you." Lydia's voice came out cracked and raw. "He knows what I saw." Harlan stood up. He brushed a bit of frost from his sleeve. "He's dead, Lydia. The judge is dead. There's nobody left to care what you saw." He turned and walked back toward the saloon. At the door, he stopped and addressed the crowd one more time. "Remember what I said. Anyone who interferes tonight will wish they hadn't. I don't like making examples, but I will." The saloon door swung shut behind him. The piano played on. The men inside laughed again. The lamps flickered, and on the frozen ground, the boy whispered one more time into the quiet, "My mother and I are freezing." Nobody answered. The night got a little colder, and somewhere on the road east of town, The sound of a horse's hooves began to beat against the frozen earth. The sound of hooves came steady out of the dark. The horse was moving at a walk, unhurried. Its breath blew twin streams of steam into the frozen air. On its back, a man sat straight and still. He wore a tan cowboy hat pulled low. A red bandana covered the lower half of his face. His coat was dusted with frost from the road. He held the reins in one gloved hand. The other rested on his thigh. The rifle was slung across his back. The horse was dark as the sky beyond the town lights. Abilene came into view piece by piece. First the glow of lanterns against the black, then the shapes of buildings, the hitching rails, the water troughs, then the people. They stood in clusters on the boardwalks. They didn't move. They stared at something in the middle of the street. The stranger pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of town. He sat for a long moment, looking. A woman was tied to a rail. Her dress was black. Her head hung forward. A boy was curled against her. He wasn't moving much. Frost clung to the boy's coat, to the woman's hair, to the rope. 3 men stood nearby, bundled in heavy coats. One had a rifle cradled in his arms. Another was stomping his boots to keep warm. The third was leaning against the post, smoking. They seemed bored. But they were watching the street. They were watching the windows. The stranger looked at the windows too. Faces filled them. Dozens of faces. No one came out. No one brought a blanket. No one even called out. The town was holding its breath. He nudged his horse forward. The slow clop of hooves turned heads. The man with the rifle looked up. The smoker straightened. The stranger rode past them without a glance. He didn't look at the woman either. Not yet. He rode toward the saloon at the end of the street. The saloon was loud. Piano music spilled out with the lamplight. Men were laughing inside. The stranger dismounted at the hitching rail. He tied off his horse with a practiced loop. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a pair of thick gloves. He tucked them into his belt. Then he pushed open the saloon doors and stepped inside. The warmth hit him first. A fire crackled in the pot-belly stove. The air smelled of whiskey, cigar smoke, and wet wool. The piano player was in the corner, pounding out a tune. A dozen men stood at the bar. A few more sat at tables with cards and coins. The barkeep was a big man with a white apron and tired eyes. He looked up when the stranger walked in. The stranger didn't go to the bar right away. He walked to a table near the stove and sat down. He pulled off his gloves. He set his hat on the table. His face was calm. His eyes moved across the room. He took in every face, every gun belt, every whiskey glass. Then he stood and walked to the bar. The barkeep was drying a glass. "What'll it be?" "Coffee," the stranger said. "Black." The barkeep poured from a pot on the stove. The coffee was thick and dark. He set the cup down. The stranger wrapped his hands around it. He didn't drink yet. He just held it, letting the heat seep through his fingers. "Long ride?" the barkeep asked. The stranger didn't answer the question. "The woman outside, she's been there long?" The barkeep's hand stopped on the glass. He glanced toward the doors. Then he looked back at the stranger. "Couple hours, maybe more." He lowered his voice. "You might want to let that alone, friend. Not a good night to get involved." "Why's that?" The barkeep leaned closer. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Curtis Harlan's men. He owns this town. He put her out there as a message. Anyone who helps her, well, they won't like what happens." The stranger's eyes didn't change. "What did she do?" "She says she saw something. A judge went missing about 6 months ago. She claims she was a witness." The barkeep paused. He looked around the room. "Most folks think she's lying, or she's crazy. Either way, nobody's going to help her." The stranger finally lifted the cup. He took a sip. The coffee was bitter. "What do you think?" The barkeep hesitated. He wiped the same spot on the bar 3 times. "I think she saw something she shouldn't have, and now she's paying for it. Her boy, too. It ain't right, but there's nothing anyone can do." The stranger set the cup down. His voice was quiet. "How many men does Harlan have?" "6 inside town right now. 3 out there with her. 3 in the back room." The barkeep nodded toward a closed door at the end of the bar. "They come out regular to check the street. They're armed." The stranger didn't look at the door. "Sheriff?" The barkeep snorted. "Tom Weston's in his office. He's been drinking since sundown. He won't step outside. He's seen what Harlan does to people who cross him. Last year, a farmer tried to stand up to Harlan. They found him in the creek 3 days later. The sheriff didn't investigate. He can't." The stranger was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his coffee. Then he looked out the window. Through the frosted glass, he could see the vague shape of the hitching rail, the dark figure of the woman, the smaller shape of the boy, the 3 men standing guard. "Her name," the stranger said. "What is it?" "Lydia Marsh. Her husband died last winter. She's been trying to hold on to their place. Harlan wants it. He forged a deed, I think. Took her house this evening. Dragged her and the boy out. Said they'd stay there till morning." The barkeep shook his head. "The boy won't last that long. He's just a child." The stranger reached into his pocket. He laid a coin on the bar, more than the coffee was worth. He picked up his hat and stood. "Where are you going?" the barkeep asked. "To talk to the sheriff." "He won't help you." "I'm not asking him for help." The stranger walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. Without turning, he said one more thing. "Thanks for the coffee." Then he stepped back into the cold. The door swung shut behind him. The piano kept playing. The men kept drinking. The barkeep watched the stranger through the window. He saw him walk down the boardwalk, past the general store, past the post office, toward the sheriff's office at the end of the street. The light was still burning inside. The stranger didn't stop at the rail, but as he passed, his eyes moved toward the woman. She was still on her knees. The boy was shaking now. Not shivering. Shaking. The kind of shaking that came before the stillness. One of the guards watched the stranger pass. The man said nothing, but his hand moved closer to his gun. The stranger kept walking. His boots crunched on the frozen dirt. He reached the sheriff's office. The door was shut. A lantern burned low inside. Through the window he could see a man slumped at the desk. A bottle was on the boards. The man's shirt was half untucked. His badge was crooked on his chest. The stranger pushed the door open. The hinges creaked. The smell of whiskey hit him. Sheriff Tom Weston looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. His hands trembled, but not from the cold. He stared at the stranger standing in his doorway. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't even sit up straight. "Who are you?" Weston's voice was a slur. The stranger closed the door behind him. He stood in the center of the small room. The stove had gone cold. The wanted posters on the wall were curling with frost. The clock on the wall ticked unevenly. "I'm the man who's going to ask you a question," the stranger said. His voice was low and hard as the frozen ground outside. "And you're going to answer it. What did Curtis Harlan do 6 months ago?" Weston's face went pale. He looked at the bottle, then at the stranger, then at the window. The wind rattled the glass. The sheriff's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He just stared at the man with the red bandana. And the silence stretched on. The sheriff's mouth worked like a man chewing on a dry piece of leather. The bottle on the desk was half empty. The glass beside it still held a finger of amber liquid. The stove had gone cold. The clock on the wall ticked and seemed to be counting down something Weston didn't want to face. The stranger stood in the center of the room. He had not moved. He had not blinked. The red bandana hung loose around his neck now, the color sharp against the gray of his vest. His eyes were steady on the sheriff, patient, like he had nowhere else to be. "I asked you a question," the stranger said. Weston's hand trembled as he reached for the glass. He didn't drink from it. He just wrapped his fingers around the rim and held on. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do." The stranger's voice was flat, calm. "A judge came through this town 6 months ago. He disappeared. The woman out there saw it happen. And so did you." Weston's face went white. Not pale. White, the color of frost on a window pane. He set the glass down too hard. Whiskey sloshed over the side and pooled on the desk. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." The stranger took one step closer. His boots made no sound on the floorboards. "You were there that night. You saw Harlan pull the trigger, and you've spent 6 months drinking yourself blind so you wouldn't have to remember." The sheriff's jaw clenched. His eyes were wet. He looked at the stranger like a man watching his own grave being dug. "If I say anything, if I even whisper, he'll kill me. He'll kill my wife. He'll burn this whole town to the ground." "The woman outside is dying," the stranger said. "Her boy is 10 years old. He's been standing in the cold for 3 hours because nobody in this town has the spine to do what's right, including you." Weston flinched. He looked at the wall, at the curling wanted posters, at anything but the stranger's face. "I can't. I'm not the man I used to be." "No," the stranger said. "You're not, but you're still wearing the badge." He turned then. He walked to the door. His hand was on the latch when the sheriff spoke again, his voice cracking like thin ice. "He's got 6 men in the saloon, all of them armed. Harlan doesn't negotiate. He doesn't back down. You walk in there, you won't walk out." The stranger didn't turn around. "I'm not walking in to negotiate." He opened the door. The cold swept in. The lantern on the desk guttered. And then he was gone, stepping back into the frozen night. Sheriff Tom Weston sat alone in the office, staring at the door. His hand found the bottle. He didn't lift it. He just sat there, trembling. Outside, the stranger walked down the boardwalk. His boots crunched on the frozen dirt. He passed the post office. He passed the general store. He did not look at the woman tied to the rail. He did not look at the guards. He walked straight toward the saloon. The lamplight from the windows threw long yellow squares across the street. The piano was still playing inside. Men were still laughing. The 3 guards near the hitching rail watched him pass. The one with the scarred cheek straightened up. He nudged the man next to him. They both turned and watched the stranger push open the saloon doors. The doors swung wide. A blast of warm air and cigar smoke rolled out, and then the doors swung shut behind him. The saloon went quiet. Not all at once, but table by table. The piano player's fingers slowed. The men at the bar turned their heads. The barkeep froze, his rag hanging limp in his hand. Every eye in the room fixed on the stranger standing just inside the doorway. The stranger didn't move. He let them look. He let the silence settle like a stone dropped in water. At the back of the room, at a large round table, Curtis Harlan sat with 5 other men. Cards were spread across the felt. Coins were stacked in piles. A cigar burned in a brass ashtray. Harlan had a whiskey glass in his hand. His black coat was draped over the back of his chair. His eyes were the only things in the saloon that didn't look surprised. They looked amused. The stranger walked forward, slow steps, unhurried. He stopped 10 feet from Harlan's table. His hands hung loose at his sides. His coat was open. The butt of his pistol was visible, but he made no move toward it. "You're Curtis Harlan," the stranger said. It wasn't a question. Harlan took a sip of his whiskey. He swirled the glass, I am, and you're a man who's about to make a very big mistake." "I've made bigger," the stranger said. "You're going to let the woman and her boy go. Tonight, right now." Someone at the bar let out a nervous laugh. Harlan didn't laugh. He set down his glass. He leaned back in his chair and looked the stranger up and down. He took in the hat, the bandana, the worn coat. He smiled. It was a thin smile, the kind a snake makes before it strikes. "And if I don't?" Harlan asked. "Then I'll walk out of here," the stranger said, "and you'll spend the rest of the night wondering when I'm coming back." Harlan's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker, just for a moment. Then he glanced at the man to his left, a big man with a scarred jaw. Then to his right, a wiry man with a knife on his belt. One by one, the 5 men at the table pushed back their chairs. The sound of chair legs scraping wood was loud in the quiet room. Hands moved to gun belts. The piano player ducked behind his instrument. The stranger didn't move. He didn't reach for his pistol. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood there, 10 feet from 6 armed men, and waited. Harlan stood up slowly. He buttoned his vest. He took his time. He picked up his cigar and took a long drag. Then he blew the smoke toward the stranger. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that. But nerve doesn't stop bullets." The stranger said nothing. His gaze didn't waver. The tension in the room pulled tight as a bowstring. Harlan's voice dropped low. "Last chance. Walk out that door. Ride away. Forget this town exists. Or my boys here are going to paint this floor with you." The 5 men fanned out. They moved to either side, forming a half circle. Their hands were on their guns. The barkeep ducked below the bar. The few remaining drinkers scrambled for the corners. The only sound was the wind outside and the creak of leather holsters. The stranger stood at the center of it all, alone, outnumbered. And he didn't step back. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just looked at Curtis Harlan with eyes that held no fear at all. And that, more than any threat, made the men in the room hesitate, because a man who doesn't fear death is the most dangerous man alive. The clock on the wall struck the hour. The chimes rang out, clear and sharp. And in that moment, the stranger spoke one last time. But what he said, no one in that saloon would ever forget. The stranger's voice cut through the silence like a blade through frost. "The judge you killed 6 months ago, the one you buried out by the dry creek bed, I know where he is." Curtis Harlan's hand stopped an inch from his pistol. The 5 men flanking him froze. The barkeep, still crouched behind the bar, didn't breathe. The piano player had flattened himself against the floor. Every man in the saloon had heard those words, and every man in the saloon knew what they meant. Harlan's face didn't change. Not at first. His smile stayed in place. But the fingers holding his cigar tightened. A tiny crackle of burning paper was the only sound. Then Harlan laughed. It was a dry laugh. Hollow. "You've been listening to a freezing woman's stories. She's crazy. Everyone knows it." "No," the stranger said. "I've been listening to a bartender who saw you ride out that night. I've been listening to a sheriff who drinks himself to sleep because he can't scrub the image from his mind. I've been listening to the whole town. They all know. They're just too scared to say it." He paused. "I'm not scared." The wiry man on Harlan's right shifted his weight. His hand was still on his gun. "Boss," he muttered, "let me drop him." Harlan didn't answer. He was staring at the stranger with a new expression. Not amusement, calculation. He was trying to figure out how much this man knew, and how many people had talked. The stranger had planted the seed. Now it was time to pull back. "Think about what I said," the stranger told Harlan. "I'll be seeing you again." He turned and walked toward the saloon doors. His back was exposed. 6 armed men stood behind him. Any one of them could have drawn and fired. But they didn't. Something in the way the stranger moved stopped them. He didn't hurry. He didn't glance over his shoulder. He walked like a man who knew he wasn't going to die tonight. And that made them all hesitate. The saloon doors swung open. A blast of frozen air rushed in. The lantern flames flickered. Then the doors swung shut. The stranger was gone. The piano player peeked out from behind his instrument. The barkeep slowly straightened up. Harlan stood motionless, the cigar burning down between his fingers. Finally he spoke. "Find him," he said, his voice low and hard. "Find him and bring him to me. I want to know who he is and where he came from. And then I want him dead." The 5 men scrambled for the door. Their boots hammered on the floorboards. The doors crashed open and they poured into the street. They scanned the boardwalks, the alleyways, the rooftops. The stranger was nowhere. It was as if the night itself had swallowed him up. Out on the street, Lydia Marsh was still on her knees. Her body had stopped shivering, which was a bad sign. The cold had settled deep in her bones. Her eyes were half closed. Henry was pressed against her side, his face buried in her dress. But he was still conscious, still fighting. The 3 guards near the hitching rail had heard the commotion from the saloon. They were on edge now. Their rifles were in their hands. Their eyes darted toward the shadows. Henry lifted his head. He was so cold that his neck barely worked. But something had caught his attention. A flicker of movement in the narrow alley between the general store and the post office. A shape moved through the darkness. Boots on frozen ground. A red bandana caught the edge of the lamplight for just a heartbeat. Then it vanished. But Henry had seen it. He had seen the man. The same man who had walked past them earlier. The one who didn't belong to Harlan's gang. The one who wasn't afraid. "Mama," Henry whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. Lydia didn't answer. She was fading. "Mama, someone came." The boy's voice was barely more than a breath, but something in it, some tiny spark of hope, made the guards turn their heads. They looked at the boy. Then they looked toward the alley. But there was nothing there, just darkness and frost and the howl of the wind. Henry kept staring at that empty space. He knew what he had seen. The man in the red bandana had looked at him, right at him. The man's eyes had been calm, not kind, not soft, but they had promised something. They had promised that this was not the end, that someone had finally ridden into Abilene who wasn't afraid of Curtis Harlan, and that changed everything. Lydia stirred. The boy's words had reached her through the fog. Someone came. 2 small words, but they cut through the cold like a knife. Her eyes opened. She looked down at her son. She saw his face, pale and cracked with cold, but his eyes were alive. They were full of something she hadn't seen in 6 months. Belief. She pulled him tighter. Her bound hands couldn't do much, but she could hold him, and she could hold on to those words. Someone came. She didn't know who. She didn't know why. But someone had come to this frozen town, and he had looked at her boy, and he had not turned away. That meant something. That meant everything. In the alley, the stranger pressed his back against the cold wall of the general store. He could hear the boots of Harlan's men pounding up and down the street. They were shouting to one another. They were checking every corner. They were angry and scared. The stranger waited. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. His breath steamed in the icy air, slow and controlled. His right hand rested near his pistol. The rifle was still slung across his back. He could hear the guards near the hitching rail talking. "There's no one here," one of them said. "Harlan's spooked over nothing." The other one grunted. "Keep looking. If we don't find him, Harlan will take it out on us." The boots moved on, down toward the livery stable. The stranger stayed still for another minute, then 2. Then he stepped forward, silent as a ghost, and moved deeper into the shadows of the back alleys. He had work to do. He had a sheriff to sober up. He had a deputy to find. He had a town full of cowards to shake awake. And he had until dawn. The clock was ticking, but the boy had seen him. The seed was planted, and the night was far from over. The stranger stayed pressed against the cold wall of the general store until the last bootsteps faded. The street fell quiet again. The wind had died down. The only sound was the distant piano from the saloon, still plinking out some tinny tune. Some men could drink through anything. He eased out of the alley and moved along the backs of the buildings. The frozen ground crunched under his boots, but he stepped light. He passed the dark windows of the feed store, the locked back door of the post office, the small yard behind the church. Every building was shut tight, every lamp was snuffed. The whole town had turned its back on the night. Ahead, past the livery stable, a sudden flash of orange lit the sky. It wasn't a lantern. It was too bright, too fast. The stranger stopped. He watched the glow climb above the roofline. Then he smelled it. Smoke. Not the soft smoke of a chimney. Thick, oily smoke. Something was burning, and it was burning fast. He moved toward it. The alley opened onto a side street. From there he could see the blacksmith's shop, or what was left of it. Flames were chewing through the roof. The wooden beams groaned. Sparks shot into the black sky like angry fireflies. The heat was so fierce that the frost on the nearby windows had melted into streaks. 3 of Harlan's men stood in the street watching. They had torches in their hands. They weren't trying to put the fire out. They were making sure it spread. One of them, the scarred man from the rail, kicked a loose piece of burning timber back toward the shop. He laughed as it skittered across the frozen dirt. "That'll teach folks to keep their mouths shut," he said. The stranger didn't move. He watched from the shadows. He saw the blacksmith's tools inside, glowing red. He saw the bellows crumble. He saw a chalkboard with prices still written on it. 25 cents for a shoe, $1 for a plow blade, curl and blacken. The blacksmith wasn't there. That was something. But the shop was gone. A man's livelihood turned to ash in 10 minutes. Because the stranger had spoken up. Because the bartender had talked. Because the town had let a man like Curtis Harlan grow roots. The fire roared on. The men with torches finally turned and headed back toward the saloon. They didn't care if the flames spread. They knew nobody would stop them. And they were right. The stranger pulled back into the alley. He needed to find the deputy, Cal Pierce. The bartender had mentioned him, the one lawman who still wore a badge but never used it. He might know something. He might be the weak link. He found Pierce behind the jailhouse. The jailhouse was a small stone building next to the sheriff's office. The back door was open. A single lantern sat on the step. The deputy was lying in the frozen dirt beside it. His face was a mess. Blood had poured from his nose and mouth and frozen in dark streaks across his cheeks. One eye was swollen shut. His left arm was bent at a wrong angle. He was breathing, but barely. The stranger kneeled beside him. He checked the pulse at Pierce's neck. Thin, weak, but there. The cold had probably kept him from bleeding out. That was a bitter kind of mercy. "Pierce," the stranger said. The deputy's good eye fluttered. He tried to focus. His lips moved, but only a croak came out. "Who did this?" Pierce coughed. A bubble of blood formed at the corner of his mouth. "Harlan's men," he whispered. "They came looking for you. I didn't know where you were. They didn't believe me." The stranger said nothing. He reached into his coat and pulled out a strip of clean cloth. He pressed it against the worst cut on the deputy's forehead. Pierce winced. "Stay still," the stranger said. "They burned the shop," Pierce said, his voice trembling. "They said they'd burn the whole town if you didn't show yourself by morning. They'll do it. They've done worse." The stranger looked toward the glow of the fire. It was starting to fade. The roof had collapsed. "Why didn't you stop them?" Pierce closed his eye. A single tear cut through the blood on his cheek. "Because I'm a coward. Same as everyone else in this town. I've watched Harlan do terrible things for 2 years. I've done nothing. Because I was scared. I'm still scared." "Not anymore," the stranger said. He helped Pierce sit up against the wall. The deputy groaned. "You're going to tell me everything you know about the judge who disappeared." Pierce stared at him. "How do you know about that?" "The bartender, the sheriff, the woman tied to the rail. Everyone knows. No one talks. You're going to talk now." The deputy's breath came in ragged gasps. His good hand gripped the stranger's sleeve. "Harlan will kill me. He'll kill my family. He'll kill more than that if nobody stops him." The stranger's voice was cold but not cruel. "The boy out there is 10 years old. He might not last till dawn. So you're going to tell me what happened that night, and then you're going to help me make it right." Pierce looked at the fire. He looked at the dark street. He looked at his own broken arm. Something inside him cracked open. The fear was still there, but under it something else. A tiny flicker of anger. The same anger that had brought him to wear a badge in the first place, before Harlan had crushed it out of him. "It was 6 months ago," Pierce said. "A circuit judge named Albright. He came through town investigating land fraud. He spent 3 days asking questions. He found out Harlan had forged a dozen deeds. He was going to take it all back to the territorial governor. Harlan couldn't let that happen. And the night the judge was supposed to leave, Harlan caught up with him on the East Road. There was an argument, then a gunshot. I heard it. I was on patrol near the edge of town. By the time I got there, it was over. The judge was dead. Harlan was standing over the body, and he wasn't alone." "Who was with him?" Pierce swallowed. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Sheriff Weston. He was there. He saw the whole thing." The stranger's expression didn't change. Not a flicker. But inside, the pieces locked into place. The sheriff's drinking, his terror, his refusal to act. Not just fear, guilt. A guilt so deep it had drowned the man entirely. Weston saw Harlan pull the trigger. He didn't just see it. He helped bury the body, out by the dry creek bed. Harlan told him if he ever spoke a word, he'd kill him and his wife. Weston never said anything. He just kept drinking, and Harlan kept taking. More land, more power, more lives. The stranger stood. He looked down at the broken deputy. "Can you walk?" "Not far." "Then stay here. I'll be back." He turned and started toward the sheriff's office, but Pierce's voice stopped him. "What are you going to do?" The stranger didn't turn around. "Same thing I came to do." He walked to the sheriff's office. The door was still unlocked. The lantern still burned low. Sheriff Tom Weston was still at his desk, staring at the same half-empty bottle. He looked up when the stranger entered. His face was a mask of dread. "Your deputy is behind the jail," the stranger said. "He's alive, but he needs a doctor. Get him one." Weston didn't move. His hands shook. "I know what you did," the stranger said. "I know you were there the night the judge died. I know you helped bury him. I know why you've been drinking yourself into an early grave." The sheriff's face crumpled. He covered his eyes with his hands. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice. You just made the wrong one." Weston looked up, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "What do you want from me?" "Tomorrow morning you're going to walk out into the street. You're going to stand in front of this town, and you're going to tell them what happened. Everything. The murder, the burial, the forged deeds, all of it." "Harlan will kill me." "No," the stranger said. "He won't, because I'll be standing right next to you, and I'll make sure he answers for what he did." Weston stared at him. The fear was still there. But something else was stirring, a tiny seed of hope, a chance for redemption, a chance to be the man he used to be. "What's your name?" Weston asked. The stranger shook his head. "Don't need one." He turned to the door. "Get your deputy to a doctor, then sober up. Dawn's coming, and when it does, the whole town's going to see what justice looks like." He walked out into the frozen night. The fire was dying. The piano had stopped, and somewhere near the hitching rail, a boy was still holding his mother, waiting for the sun to rise. The first light of dawn bled across the frozen plains, pale and thin, like a wound that wouldn't close. The cold hadn't broken. The frost still clung to the boardwalks, the hitching rails, the iron bars of the jailhouse window. But the darkness was retreating, and with it, the long, terrible night. Sheriff Tom Weston stood on the boardwalk outside his office, his breath smoking in the air. His hands were steady now. He hadn't touched the bottle in hours. His badge was pinned straight on his chest for the first time in 6 months. Beside him, the stranger stood with the lever-action rifle cradled in his arms. The red bandana was bright against the gray morning. "Are you ready?" the stranger asked. Weston looked down the empty street. He could see the woman and the boy still tied to the rail. They were alive, just barely. The boy had his eyes open, watching the sunrise. The mother's head hung low, but her chest still rose and fell. The guards had gone inside to warm themselves an hour ago. They hadn't bothered to check on their prisoners. Why would they? No one in Abilene had ever dared to stop them. "No," Weston said, "but I'm done being a coward." The stranger nodded once. Then he stepped off the boardwalk and walked toward the center of Main Street. His boots left prints in the frost. Weston followed 3 steps behind, his own boots heavy on the frozen dirt. Somewhere behind them, a door creaked open, then another. Faces appeared in windows, curtains twitched. The town was waking up. The stranger stopped 50 feet from the saloon. The building was dark, the lamps had burned out, but smoke still rose from the chimney. He knew men were inside. He knew they were armed. He didn't care. "Curtis Harlan!" His voice rang out across the street like a hammer on an anvil. "Come out here! Now!" Silence. The wind stirred the dust. Then the saloon doors creaked open. Harlan stepped onto the boardwalk, his black coat pulled tight against the cold. His eyes were bloodshot. His hand rested on his pistol. Behind him, 5 men filed out, fanning across the boardwalk. The one with the scarred cheek, the wiry man with the knife, 3 others with rifles. Harlan looked at the stranger. Then he looked at Sheriff Weston standing beside him. And for the first time, a flicker of real fear crossed his face. "Well, well," Harlan said, his voice rough from sleep and whiskey. "The sheriff found his spine. Took you long enough, Tom." Weston didn't answer. He just stood there, his hand on his own gun. The stranger took 1 step forward. "This ends now," the stranger said. "Let the woman and her boy go. Call off your men. Surrender your weapons. And confess, in front of everyone, what you did to Judge Albright." The word hit the street like a slap, the name no one had spoken for 6 months. The men on the boardwalk shifted. One of them, the man with the rifle, glanced at Harlan nervously. Harlan's jaw tightened. "You've got no proof. You've got nothing but the word of a drunk and a widow." "I've got the sheriff," the stranger said. "He saw you pull the trigger. He saw you bury the body by the dry creek bed. He's going to testify. The whole town is going to hear it." Harlan's eyes went to Weston. "You wouldn't dare. You know what I'll do to you. To your wife." Weston's voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "My wife left me 3 months ago. Because of you. Because of what I let you turn me into. I've got nothing left to lose, and I'm tired of being afraid." The stranger raised his rifle just slightly. The barrel pointed at the frozen ground. "Last chance, Harlan. Surrender, or face what's coming." Harlan looked at his men. 5 armed guns against 2. The town was watching. Every window was crowded with faces. Every door was cracked open. The bartender stood in the doorway of the saloon. The blacksmith, his shop a pile of ash, stood with his wife and daughter. Even Deputy Cal Pierce, his arm in a sling, had limped out to the boardwalk outside the doctor's office. Harlan made his choice. He drew his pistol. His men followed. 6 guns came up in a blur of motion. The stranger moved faster. The lever-action rifle came up in a single, fluid motion. The first shot caught the scarred man in the chest before his pistol cleared leather. He flew backward through the saloon doors. The second shot hit the wiry man in the shoulder, spun him around, and dropped him into the horse trough. The third and fourth shots were so fast, they sounded like one long roar. 2 riflemen went down, one clutching his stomach, the other crumpling against the boardwalk post. The 5th man, the one with the knife, took a bullet to the leg and collapsed, screaming. The whole exchange lasted less than 15 seconds. The street was filled with smoke and the ringing of gunfire. Harlan fired once. The bullet went wide, splintering the post office sign. He tried to fire again, but the stranger was already on him. The rifle was empty, but the stranger's pistol was in his hand. He knocked Harlan's weapon away with the barrel. Then he grabbed Harlan by the collar of his fine black coat and threw him into the frozen dirt. Harlan landed hard. The breath went out of him. He tried to rise. A boot slammed into his chest and pinned him flat. He looked up into the barrel of a pistol. The stranger's face was cold. His eyes held no anger, no hatred, just the quiet, terrible certainty of justice. From the hitching rail, a small voice cut through the silence. "Mama, look!" Lydia Marsh lifted her head. Her eyes were swollen, her lips cracked, but she saw it. She saw the man in the red bandana standing over Curtis Harlan like an angel of judgment. She saw the 5 men lying in the street. She saw Sheriff Weston, tears streaming down his face, walking toward the rail with a knife in his hand to cut her free. She saw the townspeople stepping out of their doorways, 1 by 1, 2 by 2, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. And she saw her son, Henry, his small face lit with something she hadn't seen in months. Hope. He was staring at the stranger with wide eyes, and he whispered it again, louder this time. Someone came. The entire town of Abilene stood frozen in the morning light, watching the cowboy with no name deliver the justice they had all been too scared to deliver themselves. And the silence that fell over Main Street was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a debt finally paid. Sheriff Tom Weston knelt beside Lydia Marsh, the knife still trembling in his hand. The rope that had bound her to the hitching rail fell away in frayed coils. Lydia slumped forward, and Weston caught her before she hit the ground. Her skin was ice-cold, her lips white, her fingers curled like claws from the long night. "Get blankets," Weston shouted, his voice cracking. "Someone now!" For a moment, nobody moved. The town was still frozen in place, watching the stranger hold Curtis Harlan down with his boot, the 5 gunmen scattered across the street like broken toys. Then a door banged open. Mrs. Hargreaves, the shopkeeper's wife, ran out with an armload of wool blankets. She was an old woman, bent and slow, but she covered the frozen ground faster than she had moved in years. 2 more women followed, one carrying a kettle of hot water, another with bread wrapped in a cloth. They wrapped Lydia first, then the boy. Henry was shivering so hard his teeth chattered, but his eyes never left the stranger. He watched the man in the red bandana as if memorizing every detail. The gray vest, the dark beard, the rifle slung across his back, its barrel still warm from the gunfire. On the ground, Curtis Harlan twisted beneath the stranger's boot. His expensive black coat was smeared with frozen mud and blood. Not his own blood. Just the dust of the street turned to grime. He coughed and spat. "You're making a mistake," he gasped. "I own this town. You can't do this." The stranger didn't look down at him. He spoke instead to the people gathered on the boardwalks. "This man killed a judge. He forged deeds. He left a woman and a child to freeze to death. You all knew. You all watched. He didn't own you. You gave yourselves to him." The words were quiet, but they cut through the morning air like a blade. No one answered. The blacksmith, standing beside the smoking ruins of his shop, lowered his head. The bartender, still in the saloon doorway, looked at his boots. The grocer, the postman, the schoolteacher. They all stood motionless, the weight of their silence pressing down on them. Deputy Cal Pierce limped forward, his broken arm in a sling, his swollen eye still half closed. In his good hand, he carried a pair of iron shackles. He knelt beside Harlan, grunting with pain, and clamped the cuffs around the gang leader's wrists. "Curtis Harlan," Pierce said, his voice unsteady but clear. "You're under arrest for the murder of Judge Albright, for arson, for assault, and for attempted murder. You'll stand trial." Harlan laughed, a bitter, desperate sound. "Trial? There's no judge left." "There will be," Weston said, rising to his feet. His face was still wet with tears, but his voice was solid now. "The territory will send another, and until then, you'll sit in my jail and think about what you did." He turned to the crowd. "I'll send a telegram to the governor today. I'll tell them everything. What I saw, what I helped cover up. I'll accept whatever punishment they see fit. I'm done hiding." A murmur ran through the townspeople. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to relief. The secret that had poisoned Abilene for 6 months was finally being pulled into the light. The air itself seemed lighter, less heavy, as if the frost might finally start to melt. 2 men from the crowd, a farmer and the livery stable owner, stepped forward and hauled Harlan to his feet. The gang leader sagged between them, his face blank with shock. They walked him toward the jailhouse. No one cheered. No one jeered. The town just watched him go, the iron shackles clanking in the silence. The stranger removed his boot from the frozen dirt and took a step back. He ejected the spent shells from his lever-action rifle, one by one, each brass casing clinking softly as it hit the ground. He reloaded with calm, practiced motions, his eyes scanning the street once more, checking the wounded men, the stunned faces, the rising sun. Sheriff Weston turned to him. "I don't know your name. I don't even know where you came from. But this town owes you a debt we can never repay." The stranger shook his head. He didn't speak. He simply holstered his pistol and walked toward the general store, where his dark brown horse stood waiting. He had left it tied there the night before, out of the wind. The animal whickered softly as he approached. Henry Marsh pulled free of the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He darted after the stranger, his small legs pumping across the frozen street. "Wait!" the boy called. "Wait, mister!" The stranger stopped. He turned. He looked down at the boy. Henry stood in front of him, breathless, still trembling from the cold, but refusing to give in to it. "I don't know your name either," the boy said. "But my mama always says that when someone saves your life, you're supposed to thank them. So thank you." He thrust out his hand, a small, dirty, chapped hand, but steady. The stranger looked at the hand. Then he reached down and shook it. His grip was firm, but gentle. He inclined his head just slightly, the barest nod, and then let go. "Go back to your mother," he said. His voice was low, a rumble like distant thunder. "She needs you." Henry nodded. He turned and ran back to Lydia, who was now sitting up against the hitching rail, a blanket around her shoulders, a tin cup of hot water in her hands. She was crying, but she was smiling. She pulled her son close and held him tight. Lydia looked up, searching for the man who had saved them. She saw him swing into the saddle, the red bandana catching the light of the rising sun. She wanted to call out, to thank him, to ask his name, but the words caught in her throat. She saw him adjust his hat. She saw him gather the reins. And then, without a backward glance, the nameless cowboy turned his horse and rode east, down the long, frozen road that led out of Abilene. The crowd watched him go. Every man, woman, and child on that street. The blacksmith, standing in the ashes of his shop, left his grief for a moment, just to watch the stranger disappear. The bartender, who had spilled his secrets in the darkness of the saloon, watched from the doorway. Deputy Pierce, leaning against the jailhouse wall, watched with his one good eye. And Henry Marsh, the boy who had been dying of cold just an hour before, watched until the horse and rider were nothing more than a speck on the horizon, swallowed by the golden light of dawn. No one spoke his name. No one knew it. He was just the stranger, the rider, the man in the red bandana who had come from nowhere and delivered justice like a hard, cold wind. And as the sun climbed higher over the plains, the town of Abilene began to stir back to life. A life without Curtis Harlan. A life built on something they had nearly forgotten: courage. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.